Welcome back to Nighttime History. Today we will be exploring winter life in a medieval village, examining the daily rhythms, survival strategies, and communal practices that defined the coldest months of the year. Thank you for joining us tonight. Sit back and relax as we dive deep into the realities of medieval winter, a season that transformed village life entirely. When the agricultural calendar paused, daylight became scarce, and communities turned inward to weather the cold through careful preparation, shared labour, and time-honoured traditions passed down through generations. Winter in medieval villages typically began in late November and extended through February, though the exact timing varied considerably by region and elevation. The transition into winter was marked not by a specific date, but by observable changes in the natural world and the completion of certain agricultural tasks. When the last of the root vegetables had been pulled from the frozen ground and the final autumn ploughing completed, villagers entered a period fundamentally different from the rest of the agricultural year. Daylight hours shortened dramatically. In northern regions, the sun might rise as late as 8 in the morning and set by 4 in the afternoon, leaving only 8 hours of usable daylight. This reduction in available working hours restructured the entire rhythm of daily life. The medieval day typically organised itself around the canonical hours observed by the church, and winter made these divisions even more pronounced. Matins, the pre-dawn prayers, occurred in complete darkness. Lauds coincided roughly with sunrise. Prime, occurring around 6 in the morning, marked the traditional beginning of the working day in other seasons, but in winter, many tasks could not commence until enough light filtered through small windows or open doorways. Terce, sext, and nun divided the shortened daylight hours. Vespers arrived with the early sunset, and compline occurred well after darkness had fallen. Villagers structured their activities around these diminishing hours of light, concentrating essential outdoor work into the brief period when visibility allowed. The reduction in daylight directly affected which tasks could be accomplished and when. Outdoor work requiring detailed visual attention had to occur during the brightest midday hours. Tasks that could be performed by firelight or in dim conditions were reserved for early morning and late afternoon. Many activities that would have been conducted outdoors during warmer months moved inside or were postponed entirely until spring. This compression of the productive day created a particular intensity during the limited hours when outdoor labour was possible, followed by long evenings spent on indoor tasks or in rest. Indoor labour dominated the winter months. While agricultural fieldwork largely ceased, the work of maintaining a household and preparing for the coming year continued without interruption. Women's work, in particular, intensified during winter. Spinning occupied countless hours. The wool shorn from sheep during the previous spring and summer had been cleaned and carded during autumn. Winter provided the extended indoor time necessary for converting this prepared fibre into thread. Spinning wheels, though increasingly common by the later medieval period, were not universal, and many women still used drop spindles, a more portable and traditional tool. The process was time-consuming but well suited to the long dark evenings. A skilled spinner could produce thread while supervising children, conversing with family members, or listening to stories and prayers. Spinning typically occurred near the fire, where light was best and hands stayed warm enough to work. The quality of thread produced in winter was often superior to that spun during warmer months because the consistent indoor humidity and temperature allowed for better control of the fibre. Women would spin for hours each day throughout the winter, accumulating enough thread to supply weaving projects for the household or to sell or trade. The rhythmic motion of spinning, the quiet whir of the wheel or the soft weight of the drop spindle created a meditative quality to winter evenings. Multiple women in a household might spin together, their work creating a collective productivity that was both social and economical. Weaving also occupied winter months, though it required more space and light than spinning. Households with looms would set them up in the area with the best natural light, typically near a window or door that could be opened briefly during the brightest part of the day. The setup of a loom for a major project was a significant undertaking, involving the measurement and threading of potentially hundreds of warp threads. Once established, however, the loom could be worked steadily throughout the winter. Women wove various textiles for household use, including sheets, tablecloths, towels, and clothing fabric. The pattern and quality of weaving varied considerably based on the skill of the weaver and the intended use of the cloth. Coarse linen for work clothing required less finesse than fine wool for a good tunic or the linen for an altar cloth. Sewing and mending consumed significant winter hours. Clothing subjected to a full year of agricultural labour required extensive repair. Tiers needed patching, worn areas needed reinforcement, and seams required re-stitching. Medieval clothing was valuable, representing a substantial investment of materials and labour, so garments were repaired repeatedly rather than discarded. Women would turn collars and cuffs to extend the life of a tunic, patch worn knees on hose, and darn holes in woolen stockings. This work required good light and was therefore often saved for the brightest part of winter days. The creation of new clothing also occurred during winter. Cutting and constructing garments from cloth woven during previous winters or purchased at market demanded careful attention. Patterns were rarely used in the modern sense. Instead, garment construction relied on traditional shapes and proportions learned through observation and practice. Food preparation in winter differed substantially from other seasons. The abundant fresh produce of summer and autumn had been replaced by preserved foods that required different handling. Grain, the staple of the medieval diet, required daily processing. Most villages had access to a mill, either water-powered or wind-powered, where grain could be ground into flour. However, milling was not always convenient during winter. Mills might freeze or become inaccessible due to snow and ice. Some households maintained small hand mills for grinding grain into flour or meal during periods when the village mill was unavailable. The hand grinding of grain was laborious work, typically performed by women or older children, and it produced a coarser flour than mill grinding. Bread baking occurred regularly throughout winter, though the frequency varied by household resources and preferences. Some villages maintained communal ovens, where households could bake bread after paying a fee, or providing a portion of the baked goods. Other households baked bread on their own hearths. Winter bread often incorporated a higher proportion of cheaper grains like barley, oats, or rye, compared to the wheat bread that might be consumed during more prosperous times of year. Maslin, a mixture of wheat and rye, was common. The bread served as the foundation of most meals, accompanied by pottage, cheese, or preserved meats when available. Pottage, a thick stew or porridge, was prepared almost daily throughout winter. The contents varied based on what was available, but typical winter pottage incorporated dried peas or beans, perhaps some preserved vegetables like onions or leeks stored in root cellars, and on fortunate occasions, a piece of salt pork or bacon for flavouring. The pottage pot hung over the fire constantly, with new ingredients added as needed, and the mixture simmering for hours. This cooking method made efficient use of fuel, as the fire needed for heating also served for cooking. The resulting dish provided warmth and nutrition, though its monotony could wear on households as winter progressed. Rationing food stores was a critical aspect of winter survival. The harvest gathered during autumn had to sustain the household until the next harvest, a period of roughly 9 to 10 months. Careful families had calculated their stores and determined a sustainable rate of consumption. Running short of food before spring planting could be completed was a real danger, and historical records indicate that late winter and early spring were periods of particular hardship when the previous year's stores had diminished, but new food was not yet available. Households monitored their grain supplies carefully, sometimes measuring out a week's worth of grain at a time to ensure the family did not consume too rapidly. Preserved meats provided important nutrition, but had to be consumed sparingly. The slaughtering that occurred in late autumn had produced salt pork, bacon, and in wealthier households, hams and sausages. These items hung in the coolest, driest parts of the house, often in an upper room or loft, where smoke from the fire would help preserve them further. Salt fish, particularly herring, supplemented meat supplies, especially during Lent and other fasting periods. The salt fish required soaking before cooking to remove excess salt, a process that took planning and access to clean water, which could be challenging when wells and streams froze. Dairy products in winter came primarily from stored cheeses. Fresh milk production dropped dramatically as cows either went dry during pregnancy or produced minimal amounts in response to reduced feed quality and cold temperatures. The cheeses made during the abundant milk production of spring and summer were now carefully rationed. Hard cheeses could last for months if stored properly in cool, dry conditions. Butter, when available, was typically salted for preservation and used sparingly for cooking or as a spread for bread on special occasions. Root cellars and storage areas required regular monitoring. Vegetables stored there, including turnips, parsnips, carrots and onions, needed checking for signs of rot. A single rotting vegetable could spread decay to others nearby, so householders inspected their stores periodically, removing any items showing deterioration. The vegetables were often stored in sand or straw to help regulate moisture and temperature. Apples, if the household had access to an orchard, were stored carefully, sometimes wrapped individually or layered with straw. Not all apple varieties stored equally well, and households had learned through experience which types would last until spring and which needed to be consumed earlier in winter or preserved through drying. Keeping warm was a constant concern that shaped nearly every aspect of winter life. Medieval buildings were poorly insulated by modern standards. Walls of wattle and daub, timber framing, or even stone offered limited protection from the cold. Windows, when present, were small and often covered with oiled cloth, thin horn, or wooden shutters rather than glass, which was expensive and rare in village homes. Shutters could be closed to keep out the worst of the cold, but this also blocked precious daylight, creating a constant trade-off between warmth and light. The hearth was the centre of winter life. Most village homes had a single central fire that provided heat, light, and cooking capability. The fire burned continuously throughout winter, tended carefully to ensure it never went out entirely, as rekindling a fire without matches was time-consuming and required either preserved coals, flint and steel, or borrowing fire from a neighbour. Fuel consumption during winter was substantial, and many households had spent portions of autumn gathering firewood to build adequate stores. The type and quality of fuel varied by region and access to resources. Wooded areas provided the best fuel. Hardwoods like oak, ash and beech burned hot and long, making them ideal for overnight fires. Softwoods burned more quickly, but were easier to split and could be useful for getting fires started or providing quick heat. In areas where wood was scarce, alternative fuels became necessary. Dried peat, cut from bogs during summer, provided fuel in many regions, particularly in areas of England, Scotland, Ireland and other locations with suitable wetlands. Peat burned with a distinctive smell and produced a different quality of heat than wood, but it was renewable and often more accessible than timber in certain regions. Dried animal dung served as fuel in areas where both wood and peat were unavailable. Cow dung, collected and dried during warmer months, could be burned for heat and cooking. While not ideal, it was a practical solution in fuel-poor areas. Straw and dried grasses could also serve as supplemental fuel, though they burned very quickly and provided relatively little heat. Agricultural waste, including dried bean and pea vines, might be added to fires to extend wood supplies. Managing the fire required skill and attention. Banking the fire for overnight involved covering the coals with ash to slow combustion while maintaining enough heat to easily revive the flames in the morning. Someone in the household, often the eldest woman or a responsible older child, would wake during the night to check the fire and add fuel if necessary. Allowing the fire to go out completely was considered a serious household failure, representing both wasted resources and potential danger if the family went without heat during the coldest part of the night. Sleeping arrangements in winter focused on warmth conservation. Families typically slept in the warmest part of the dwelling, often in a room adjacent to or above the main living area where heat from the fire would rise. Beds, when present, were enclosed with curtains or built into alcoves to trap heat. Straw mattresses provided some insulation from the cold floor or bed frame. Woolen blankets and furs, if the family possessed them, were piled on for warmth. Family members often slept together for shared body heat, with multiple people in a single bed being common practice. Those who could not afford proper beds slept on straw pallets on the floor, positioned as close to the fire as safely possible. Children might sleep in the loft area above the main room where rising heat accumulated. The wealthy might have feather mattresses and multiple layers of blankets, but even in prosperous households, winter sleeping was cold by modern standards. People went to bed in layers of clothing, sometimes including caps and even cloaks if the cold was severe. Livestock management during winter presented specific challenges. Animals that had grazed freely during warmer months now required shelter and stored feed. Cattle, sheep, goats and pigs needed protection from the worst weather. The quality and extent of animal housing varied considerably. Wealthier villagers might have dedicated barns or byres for their animals, while poorer families sometimes housed valuable animals in the same building as the human family, separated by a partition but benefiting from shared warmth. Cattle in particular required substantial care. Oxen, essential for ploughing, needed to be maintained in working condition through the winter despite reduced feed availability. Cows, whether kept for milk production or breeding, required regular feeding and watering. The hay cut and dried during summer was now distributed carefully. Cattle consumed large quantities and supplies had to last until spring grass emerged. Straw left over from grain threshing supplemented hay, but had lower nutritional value. In hard winters, or when hay stores ran short, cattle might be fed branches and leaves collected from trees, or any other available roughage. We hope you're enjoying tonight's journey into medieval winter. If you find yourself drawn to these nighttime travels through history, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications to support our channel. A like on this video helps us continue bringing you these quiet historical explorations. Let us know in the comments where you're settling in to sleep tonight and what time it is where you are as you listen to this piece of the past. Sheep required different winter management than cattle. Their wool provided some protection from cold, but they still needed shelter from the worst weather, particularly from cold rain and snow that could mat their fleece and lead to dangerous chilling. Flocks were often brought into sheltered areas during storms. Ewes pregnant with spring lambs received extra attention and sometimes supplemental feeding to ensure healthy births when lambing season began in late winter or early spring. Sheep would be checked regularly for foot problems, as wet winter conditions could lead to hoof rot and other ailments. The close quarters of winter housing increased the risk of disease spreading through a flock, so shepherds monitored their animals carefully for any signs of illness. Pigs, often allowed to forage freely during autumn to fatten on acorns and beech nuts in wooded areas, were now either slaughtered for winter meat or maintained through the cold months on household scraps, spoiled grain, and any other available feed. Pigs were hardy and could tolerate cold better than many assumed, but they still needed shelter from wind and precipitation. A simple pigsty with a roof and windbreak sufficed in many cases. Breeding sows, kept for spring farrows, received the best available feed to ensure successful reproduction. Poultry continued to be maintained through winter, though egg production dropped dramatically as daylight hours shortened and temperatures fell. Chickens, ducks, and geese needed shelter from predators and weather. They might be housed in a small henhouse or kept in a sheltered corner of a barn or shed. Feed consisted of grain scraps, kitchen waste, and anything they could forage during the brief periods when they were allowed outside. The eggs produced during winter were particularly valuable and were often saved for special occasions or used in baking rather than consumed as everyday food. Watering animals in winter presented specific difficulties when natural water sources froze. Wells might remain accessible, but carrying water to animals multiple times daily in freezing conditions was arduous work. Ice that formed on water troughs and buckets needed to be broken regularly. Some farmers brought snow into animal shelters, allowing it to melt gradually to provide drinking water, though this was less efficient than liquid water. Ensuring animals had adequate water was as important as feeding them, as dehydration could occur even in cold weather, particularly from milk-producing animals. Mucking out animal shelters became more challenging in winter. The manure that accumulated in barns and byres needed periodic removal, but frozen ground made spreading it on fields impractical. Instead, manure piles accumulated near animal shelters throughout winter. The fermenting manure actually generated heat, and in some regions, farmers deliberately built up deep bedding in animal stalls, adding fresh straw on top of manure and allowing the composting action to generate warmth that helped keep animals comfortable. This deep litter system would be cleaned out in spring when the well-rotted manure could be spread on fields to enrich the soil. Tool maintenance and repair filled many winter hours. The agricultural implements that had been used intensively throughout the growing season now required attention to ensure they would be ready when spring work began. Wooden plough parts needed examination for cracks, splits, or worn areas. Replacing these components during winter meant they would be ready when ploughing time arrived. Handles for tools like hoes, rakes, and spades were checked and replaced if necessary. The winter months provided time for the careful work of shaping new handles from properly seasoned wood. Metal tools required different maintenance. Plowshares, the iron blades that cut through soil, wore down during use and needed resharpening or replacement. Villagers who owned metal tools often took them to the blacksmith during winter for repair and sharpening. The blacksmith's forge remained active throughout winter, serving the community's needs for tool repair, horseshoeing when necessary, and the production of various metal items. The warmth of the smithy made it a gathering place during cold weather, where men might congregate to discuss village affairs while waiting for work to be completed. Scythes and sickles, essential for harvest work, received careful attention. The long winter storage period could lead to rust if tools were not properly maintained. Blades were cleaned, sharpened, and sometimes oiled or greased to prevent corrosion. Wooden elements of these tools, including handles and grain cradles, were inspected and repaired. The time invested in tool maintenance during winter paid dividends when the intense work periods of spring planting and summer harvest arrived, and tools needed to function reliably under heavy use. Rope and cordage wore out constantly in agricultural life and required replacement. Winter provided time for rope making, either from purchased materials or from plant fibers gathered and processed by the household. Straw rope, though not as strong as hemp rope, could be made from materials readily at hand and served for many purposes. Twisted straw bands could tie bundles of grain, secure loads, and handle numerous other tasks. Making such rope was skilled work, but could be done indoors during long winter evenings. Basket making was another winter craft. Willow withies cut during late autumn or early winter, while the sap was down, were ideal for basketry. These needed to be soaked to make them pliable, then woven into baskets of various sizes and shapes for different agricultural and household purposes. Large baskets served for carrying grain, vegetables, or other farm products. Small baskets might hold eggs or bread. Flat-bottomed baskets could be used for winnowing grain. A skilled basket maker could produce items for household use and potentially for sale or trade. The work required manual dexterity and patience, but could be accomplished with minimal tools. Harness repair occupied time for households that maintained draft animals. The leather straps, collars, and other components of ox or horse harness wore and cracked with use and exposure to weather. Winter provided opportunity to oil and condition leather, restitch worn seams, and replace components that had become too damaged for continued use. Households without leatherworking skills might trade with specialists or barter for repair services, but many farmers performed basic harness maintenance themselves. Building and construction projects, while limited by weather, did occur during winter when conditions permitted. Repairs to buildings that could be postponed during the busy agricultural season now received attention. Thatched roofs needed periodic maintenance. Thatch deteriorated over time, and sections that had become thin or damaged required patching. Completely rethatching a roof was a major undertaking typically done in autumn, but minor repairs could be accomplished during winter when weather allowed. The thatcher would replace damaged bundles of straw or reed, ensuring the roof continued to shed water effectively. Wattle and daub walls required periodic maintenance. The daub, a mixture of clay, dung and straw, cracked and eroded over time, particularly on exterior walls exposed to weather. During dry periods in winter, damaged sections could be patched with fresh daub. Interior walls also needed attention. The whitewash applied to interior daub surfaces for light reflection and cleanliness wore away and needed periodic renewal. New whitewash made from lime, water, and sometimes other additives, could be applied during winter to freshen interior spaces. Fences required regular repair and replacement. The woven hazel or willow fences that marked property boundaries and enclosed fields deteriorated relatively quickly. Posts rotted at ground level and woven sections broke down. Winter provided time to cut new fencing materials from coppiced woodland, though installation often had to wait for ground to thaw enough to set posts. Hedging, the living fences created by carefully managed rows of shrubs and trees, required annual maintenance through pleaching and laying. Work that was typically done in late winter when plants were dormant but before spring growth began. Gate construction and repair filled winter hours. Farm gates endured heavy use and needed periodic replacement. Building a sturdy gate required skill in woodworking and an understanding of how to create a structure that would hang properly and last for years. Simple gates might be constructed by any competent farmer, but more complex designs required greater expertise. The time invested in building a good gate during winter meant reliable service during the busy seasons when gates were constantly used. Furniture making occurred during winter in households with appropriate skills and tools. Most medieval village furniture was simple and functional. Stools and benches for seating, tables for eating and working, storage chests for valuables and clothing, and bed frames were the primary pieces. Construction used local timber, typically oak for its strength and durability, though other woods might substitute based on availability. Furniture was built to last, often serving multiple generations. Winter provided the extended indoor time needed for the careful work of joinery and construction. Wooden bowls, plates and utensils, essential for daily eating, could be carved during winter evenings. This work required sharp knives and patience, but could transform scrap wood into useful household items. The resulting pieces, while simple, were functional and represented the household's self-sufficiency. Children might learn carving skills by watching and assisting adults in these projects, knowledge they would carry forward to their own households. Smithing, though a specialised trade, was essential to village life, and the smith's work continued through winter. In addition to agricultural tool repair, smiths produced nails, hinges, handles, chains, and countless other iron items necessary for daily life. Some smiths also worked as farriers, shoeing horses and oxen as needed. The heat of the forge made the smithy relatively comfortable even in cold weather, and the smith's skills were valued year-round. Payment for smith work might come in the form of grain, labour, or other goods rather than cash, particularly in villages where money remained scarce. Milling operations continued through winter, when water flow and weather permitted. Water mills required regular maintenance. The wooden gears, axles, and other mechanical components needed periodic inspection and repair. Millstones wore down with use and needed redressing, the process of recutting the grooves that ground grain effectively. This skilled work was typically done by specialised millstone dressers who travelled from mill to mill. The miller himself performed routine maintenance, keeping the mill in working order through the winter months when demand for grinding services continued despite reduced activity in the fields. Brewing occurred regularly throughout winter. Ale, the primary beverage for many medieval villages, required constant production as it did not keep well. Small beer, a weak ale suitable for everyday drinking including by children, was brewed frequently. Stronger ale for adults and special occasions required more grain and careful attention to the brewing process. The work was typically done by women, often as part of regular household routines. Brewing required clean water, grain, and yeast, plus the knowledge of proper proportions and techniques. The weak heat of fermentation actually provided a minor benefit to the household during cold weather, and the ale produced provided both nutrition and safe hydration, as the brewing process killed many waterborne pathogens. Malting grain, the process of allowing grain to sprout slightly before drying it for brewing, occurred in dedicated malt houses or in portions of regular houses set aside for the purpose. The controlled sprouting converted starches in the grain to sugars that would ferment into alcohol. The process required careful temperature and moisture control, skills that experienced brewers had mastered through long practice. Malt was valuable and could be sold or traded, making it an important commodity in village economics. Baking continued through winter, as already described, but bread was not the only baked good produced. Pies, both savoury and sweet, made use of winter stores. Meat pies incorporated small amounts of precious preserved meat combined with vegetables and grains to create filling meals. The pastry crust served as much as a cooking vessel as something to be eaten, particularly for lower quality crusts made from coarse flour and water. Fruit preserved from autumn could be baked into tarts and pies, providing variety to the winter diet. The baking of special breads and cakes marked religious feast days throughout winter, adding moments of celebration to the season's routines. Water management in winter presented unique challenges. Wells were essential for most villages, providing the primary water source for drinking, cooking, washing, and animal care. When wells froze, access to water became difficult. Some wells were deep enough that they did not freeze entirely, but drawing water from a partially frozen well required breaking surface ice repeatedly. Streams and ponds used for washing and watering animals often froze solid, requiring villagers to chop through ice to access water or to melt snow and ice for their needs. Laundering clothes and household linens, always a substantial task, became more challenging in winter. The process required large quantities of water and benefited from warm weather for drying. As a result, major washing was often postponed during the coldest months. Small items might be washed as needed, but large-scale laundering of sheets, towels and clothing waited for warmer days. When washing did occur in winter, clothes were dried near the fire, creating steam and dampness in the house, but ensuring garments dried thoroughly rather than freezing stiff on outdoor drying lines. Personal hygiene varied considerably by social class and available resources. Full-body bathing was infrequent during winter for most villagers. The labour of heating sufficient water and the difficulty of drying thoroughly in a cold house made bathing impractical for routine hygiene. Instead, people washed hands, faces and feet, regularly using small amounts of heated water. Clothing absorbed body oils and odours, and the same garments might be worn continuously for extended periods, particularly outer layers that were difficult to wash. Soap production might occur during winter using rendered animal fat from autumn butchering combined with lye made from wood ashes. The process required careful proportions and considerable skill to produce effective soap rather than a caustic mess. Many households made simple soft soap for washing, while harder soaps for personal use were more difficult to produce and might be purchased if available. The value of soap meant it was used sparingly, reserved for necessary cleaning rather than used freely. Religious observation structured winter life significantly. The church calendar provided a framework of feast days, fast days, and holy days that punctuated the season. Advent, the period of preparation before Christmas, was observed with fasting and prayer. Christmas itself was a major feast, one of the few times during winter when special foods might be prepared and consumed. The 12 days of Christmas, extending to Epiphany, were a period of reduced work and increased celebration, though the extent of festivities varied by local custom and household resources. Candlemas, celebrated on February 2nd, marked an important point in the winter calendar. The blessing of candles on this feast day provided households with consecrated candles for the coming year. The day also had significance in folk tradition, with weather on Candlemas supposedly predicting the arrival of spring. The lengthening of daylight by this point in winter was noticeable and offered psychological encouragement that the worst of the season would soon pass. Lent, beginning in late winter, imposed dietary restrictions that affected household food consumption. The prohibition on meat during Lent meant greater reliance on fish, eggs when available, and vegetables. For poorer households whose winter diet already lacked much meat, Lent might not dramatically change eating patterns, but for more prosperous villagers, the shift to Lenten foods was noticeable. The timing of Easter varied each year based on lunar calculations, affecting when Lent began and ended, but the observance always occurred during the late winter or early spring transition period. Saints' days throughout winter provided breaks from routine labour. These holy days, when work was restricted, offered opportunities for attending church services, socialising with neighbours, and resting from daily toil. The particular saints celebrated varied by region and local tradition, with some villages having special devotion to particular saints while observing others more generally. Community activities during winter took on different character than those of warmer seasons. The intensive cooperative labour of harvest was absent, but villagers still interacted regularly. Church attendance on Sundays and holy days brought the community together for worship and socialising. The church building itself, while cold, provided a gathering space and a connection to the larger Christian community beyond the village. Storytelling flourished during long winter evenings. Gathered around the fire, families and neighbours shared tales passed down through generations. These might include legends of saints, stories of local heroes, folk tales explaining natural phenomena, or recounting of historical events. Such oral tradition served both entertainment and educational purposes, transmitting cultural knowledge and values from one generation to the next. The stories helped pass the long dark hours and created shared cultural reference points within the community. Music making, where instruments were available, provided another form of winter entertainment. Simple instruments like flutes, pipes or drums might be played during evening gatherings. Singing was common, including both religious hymns learned at church and secular songs traditional to the region. The music served to lift spirits during the dark months and provided a form of expression that required no materials beyond voice or simple instruments that could be homemade. Games and contests occupied some winter leisure time. Simple board games played with stones or carved pieces offered entertainment. Dice games were popular, though sometimes frowned upon by religious authorities due to gambling associations. Physical contests, when weather permitted, might include wrestling, stick fighting, or other tests of strength and skill that allowed young men to prove themselves and compete for status within village hierarchy. Children's activities during winter adapted to the indoor focus of the season. Young children stayed close to the fire and their mothers, often helping with simple tasks like carding wool or running small errands within the house. Older children had more responsibilities, assisting with animal care, fetching water and firewood, and learning the skills they would need as adults. Play occurred when time permitted, with children creating toys from available materials like sticks, stones, and scraps of cloth. Winter did not eliminate childhood entirely, but the reduced daylight and increased survival demands meant less time for pure play than might occur during summer. Education for children, when it occurred at all in village settings, might take place more regularly during winter. Boys destined for religious life might receive instruction from the village priest in basic literacy and Latin. Such education was exceptional rather than typical, as most village children did not learn to read or write. Instead, education consisted primarily of learning practical skills through observation and participation in adult work. Girls learned textile production, food preparation, and household management from their mothers and other women. Boys learned agricultural skills, animal husbandry, and trades from their fathers and other men. Illness and injury during winter posed particular dangers. The cold weather increased risk of respiratory ailments. The reduced diet weakened resistance to disease. Close indoor quarters facilitated the spread of illness among family members. Medical care in villages was limited and based primarily on traditional remedies passed down through generations. Herbal treatments made from plants gathered and dried during warmer months were applied according to traditional understanding of their properties. Some villages had women known for healing skills who might be consulted in cases of illness, though their knowledge was empirical rather than based on formal medical training. Childbirth occurred throughout the year, including winter, and winter births posed particular challenges. The cold made it difficult to keep mother and newborn warm. The limited diet during winter might affect the mother's ability to produce adequate breast milk. Infant mortality was high in all seasons, but winter births faced additional environmental stresses. Experienced women in the village assisted with births, providing practical help and traditional knowledge about managing labour and caring for newborns. The survival of mother and child through birth, and the vulnerable weeks afterward, was celebrated as a blessing when successful and mourned deeply when unsuccessful. Death during winter was not uncommon, particularly among the very young, the elderly, and those already weakened by illness. The frozen ground made burial difficult, and bodies might need to be kept until the ground thawed enough to dig graves. The church provided structure for mourning and burial rites, offering spiritual comfort to survivors. The community gathered to support bereaved families, sharing the burden of grief within the close-knit village structure. Village governance and social organisation continued through winter. The manor court, which handled local legal matters and enforced manorial regulations, might meet periodically during winter to address disputes, assign labour obligations, and manage common resources. These court sessions were typically less frequent in winter than during the active agricultural season, but still provided structure for resolving conflicts and maintaining social order. The relationship between villagers and their lord, whether the lord was an individual nobleman, a religious institution, or the king, continued through winter. Labour obligations owed to the lord were reduced during winter compared to peak agricultural seasons, but some duties remained. Maintenance work on manorial buildings, roads, and infrastructure might be required. The delivery of rents in kind, whether grain, animals, or other products, often occurred around specific calendar dates that might fall during winter months. Forest management and wood gathering remained important winter activities when weather permitted. Common rites to gather fallen wood in manorial forests provided crucial fuel for many families. The distinction between dead fallen wood, which commoners could gather, and live wood, which typically required permission, was significant. Villagers exercised these common rites carefully, aware that overstepping boundaries could result in fines or loss of privileges. The gathering of wood for specific purposes like tool handles, fence posts, or construction timber might require special permission from the lord or his forester. Hunting rights were generally reserved for the nobility, but poaching occurred despite legal prohibitions and harsh penalties. The temptation to supplement a meagre winter diet with wild game led some villagers to risk illegal hunting. Rabbits, deer, wild birds, and other game represented valuable protein that could make the difference between adequate nutrition and hunger. The enforcement of hunting restrictions varied by region and the diligence of foresters and gamekeepers, but the penalties for poaching could be severe, including fines, imprisonment, or physical punishment. Fishing, where available, provided a legal means of obtaining protein during winter. Ice fishing through frozen ponds and streams was practiced in some regions. Traps and weirs set in running water could catch fish even during cold weather, though ice formation made maintaining such installations challenging. Fish caught during winter supplemented the diet and, if preserved through salting or smoking, could extend food stores further into the hungry months of late winter and early spring. Markets and trade diminished during winter but did not cease entirely. Market towns that operated weekly markets during warmer months might reduce to monthly winter markets or suspend them entirely during the worst weather. However, some trade continued as households sold surplus products to obtain items they could not produce themselves. Salt, metal goods, specialized tools, pottery, and certain foodstuffs might be purchased at market. The winter markets were also social occasions, providing opportunity to see people from beyond one's immediate village and exchange news and information. Travelling during winter was difficult and dangerous. Roads that were merely rough during dry weather became quagmires of mud during wet periods and impassable when snow and ice accumulated. Nonetheless, some travel occurred. Merchants moved goods between markets. Officials travelled on governmental or manorial business. Pilgrims continued their religious journeys, though in reduced numbers. The risks of winter travel included exposure to cold, difficulty finding food and shelter, swollen and icy streams to ford, and increased danger from bandits who might be desperate themselves during the lean months. Monasteries and religious houses maintained more elaborate routines through winter than typical villages. The monastic life of prayer, work, and study continued on its regular schedule, regardless of season. Monasteries served as centers of learning, preserving and copying manuscripts during the long winter months when agricultural work was minimal. The scriptoria, rooms dedicated to manuscript production, were among the few places where writing and reading occurred regularly in medieval society. Monks illuminated manuscripts, copied texts, and maintained the written records that preserved knowledge from earlier periods. Monasteries also served charitable functions, providing food and shelter to the poor and travellers. The monastic commitment to hospitality meant that even during winter scarcity, monasteries attempted to aid those in need, though resources were limited. The grain stores and food supplies that monasteries accumulated through their extensive agricultural operations, and the donations of the faithful allowed them to extend charity when secular resources were depleted. The production of items for church use continued in specialized workshops and households with appropriate skills. Candles for church services were made from beeswax rather than the tallow used for household lighting. The superior quality and lack of odor of beeswax made it appropriate for sacred purposes. Some households kept bees and processed beeswax, selling or donating it to churches. The making of beeswax candles required skill to create straight, clean-burning tapers appropriate for altar use. Vestment production and repair occupied some winter hours in households with needlework skills. The elaborate garments worn by priests during Mass required fine sewing and often decorative embroidery. Women with sufficient skill might take on such work, either as paid labour or as pious donation. The creation of altar cloths, corporals, and other liturgical linens also occurred, with the finest linen and most careful work dedicated to these sacred purposes. Bell ringing marked the hours and called the faithful to prayer throughout winter. The church bells, audible across the village and surrounding fields, structured daily time even when the sun was obscured by clouds or darkness. The ringers, often young men of the village, maintained this service through the coldest weather, climbing into unheated bell towers to pull the ropes at the appointed hours. The sound of bells carried across the frozen landscape, a reminder of continuity and community even in the depths of winter. Preparation for spring began before winter ended. As February turned to March, attention shifted toward the coming agricultural season. Tools that had been repaired during winter needed to be gathered and readied for use. Seeds for spring planting were checked and prepared. The grain saved for seed was kept separate from food stores and protected carefully, as the success of the coming year depended on having adequate quality seed for planting. Fields required planning and preparation. The crop rotation systems used in most villages meant that fields previously planted with autumn crops would be prepared for spring crops, while some fields would lie fallow to recover fertility. Villagers discussed and decided on planting strategies, drawing on traditional knowledge of what crops succeeded in particular fields and what rotations best maintained soil productivity. The anticipation of spring grew as daylight lengthened noticeably by late February. The worst cold might still occur in early March, but the psychological shift toward the coming growing season began as villagers could see the end of winter approaching. Food stores were assessed to determine if they would last until fresh food became available. Households that had managed their winter stores well could feel confident of making it through. Those whose supplies had run short-faced difficult weeks ahead, relying on community charity, gleaning, foraging for early wild edibles, and any other means to bridge the gap until crops could be planted and early vegetables harvested. The end of winter was marked not by a calendar date, but by observable changes. The thawing of frozen ground, the return of migratory birds, the appearance of early spring flowers, and the greening of grass and new plant growth all signaled the transition. Farmers tested the soil to determine when it was ready for ploughing. Too early, and the wet soil would be damaged by being worked. Too late, an optimal planting time would be missed. Experienced farmers had learned to read the signs of their particular location, knowing when conditions were right to begin the intensive work of spring planting. Winter in medieval villages was a time of endurance and careful management. The season tested both the physical resources accumulated during warmer months and the social bonds that held communities together. Survival depended on adequate preparation, skilled management of limited resources, and the ability to maintain household and community through the long months when nature provided little and demanded much. The rhythms of winter life, shaped by short days, scarce resources, and the constant work of staying warm and fed, reflected adaptations developed over generations to meet the challenges of the season. When spring finally arrived, it brought not only warmer weather and renewed growth, but also validation that another winter had been successfully endured. Thank you for joining us on this journey through winter in a medieval village. If you enjoyed our work and are still awake, check out our other medieval content. And if you've fallen asleep, please relax and enjoy the campfire.